I had been working as a night watcher in the mall for about 6 months, and while the job was boring, it paid the bills. I had always been a bit of a night owl, so I didn't mind the late hours, and the mall was usually quiet at night, so I had plenty of time to myself. One night, as I was making my rounds through the mall, I noticed that one of the stores was still open. I checked my watch, and it was well past midnight, so I knew something wasn't right. I decided to investigate and walked towards the store, my flashlight illuminating the darkened hallway. As I got closer, I could see that the store's lights were on, that the shutters were closed, so I couldn't see inside. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I was about to walk away and call the police when I heard a strange noise coming from inside the store. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate further. I walked back to the security office and grabbed the master key, then returned to the store and unlocked the shutter. As I opened the shutter, I was hit with a musty smell, like something had been rotting in there for a while. The smell was so bad that I had to cover my nose with my sleeve. I cautiously stepped inside, shining my flashlight around the room. The store was a mess. The shelves had been knocked over, and there were clothes and other items strewn all over the floor. It looked like a tornado had hit the place. As I made my way further into the store, I noticed that the smell was getting worse. Then I heard it again, the dragging noise. I shined my flashlight towards the sound, and that's when I saw it. There was a figure in the middle of the store, but it wasn't human. It was tall and thin, with long arms and fingers that seemed to stretch out like tendrils. Its face was distorted and twisted, with a gaping mouth and sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I froze in terror as the creature slowly turned its head towards me, and then it began to move towards me with a jerky, unnatural gait. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move, and it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. The creature was getting closer, and I could see it more clearly now. Its skin was pale and mottled, and its long hair was tangled and matted. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, and it looked like it had been feeding on something. As it reached out to grab me, I woke up. I was in my bed, drenched in sweat. It was all just a dream, but it felt so real that it took me a few moments to realize that I was safe. I went back to work the next day, feeling a bit shaken up, but I tried to push the dream out of my mind. I went about my usual routine, but as the night wore on, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. The lights in the hallway flickered, and I heard strange noises coming from the stores. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Then, as I was walking down a deserted hallway, I saw it again. The creature from my dream was standing at the end of the hallway, its eyes locked onto mine. I froze in terror, unable to move as the creature began to move towards me. Its unnatural gait and twisted features were just as I had dreamed them. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The creature was getting closer and closer, and I could feel its hot, foul breath on my face. I closed my eyes and braced for the worst. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the hallway. The lights had stopped flickering, and the strange noises had ceased. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew that I couldn't stay in the mall any longer. I quickly made my way back to the security office and grabbed my things. As I walked out of the mall, I could feel eyes on me, as if the creature was still watching me from the shadows. Years later, I heard rumors of strange happenings at that mall. People reported hearing strange noises and seeing shadowy figures lurking in the dark corners. Some even claimed to have seen the same creature that had haunted me all those years ago. I don't know what happened in that mall, but I do know one thing for certain. There are some things that we're not meant to see, and some places that we're not meant to go. And if you do find yourself in a situation like mine, just remember to trust your instincts and get out as quickly as possible. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness, waiting to drag you down into the abyss. I was working the night shift at the office, and it was just me and the sound of the air conditioning. The only light came from the computer screen in front of me. I had been working for hours, and I was exhausted. As a child, I had always been fascinated with horror stories and scary movies. I loved the thrill of being scared, of feeling my heart racing in my chest. As I grew up, my love for horror only grew stronger, and I eventually found myself working as a screenwriter for a horror movie production company. But nothing could have prepared me for the horror that I would experience that night in the office. I had been working for hours, staring at the same screen, typing away at the keyboard. The air conditioning was the only sound in the empty office. But then I heard it, a creaking noise, as if someone was walking across the floor. I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. I froze, listening intently, but there was no one there. I chided myself for being paranoid and tried to continue working, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. Every time I turned around, I felt as though someone was watching me. It was as if the empty office was filled with eyes, all focused on me. I tried to ignore the feeling and focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if the eyes were following my every move, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I felt as if I was in danger, but I couldn't explain why. The office felt different now, colder, darker, as if the very air was alive with some malevolent force. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I wasn't even sure if I had heard it at first. But then I heard it again, a little louder, a little closer. The whisper was a woman's voice, and it sent shivers down my spine. I knew that I was no longer alone in the office, and that whatever was with me was not human. Then I heard a whisper, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it. It was a voice, a woman's voice, but it was barely audible. I looked around the darkened office, but there was no one there. Just as I turned back to my computer, I heard it again. This time, it was a little louder, a little closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the whisper grew in intensity. I sat frozen in my chair, not daring to move. The whisper grew louder and louder until it was a deafening roar in my ears. It was as if the voice was coming from inside my own head. I tried to cover my ears, but it was no use. The sound was everywhere, filling the office with a terrible, overwhelming noise. It wasn't just a voice I was hearing now. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The words were garbled, and I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound was terrifying. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, as if the very air was alive with a malevolent force. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The office was silent once again. I sat there, trembling with fear, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. I was alone, but I no longer felt safe. I packed up my things as quickly as possible and left the office, the echoes of those whispers ringing in my ears. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't know if I would ever be able to return. As I packed up my things and left the office that night, I knew that I would never feel the same way about working alone again. Something had been in that office with me, something I couldn't explain or understand. And I knew that I would always wonder if it was still there, waiting for me to return.
As a veteran miner, Jack had seen his share of danger and close calls, but he had always managed to emerge unscathed, with nothing but a few scratches and bruises to show for it. That was until the night shift. It started out like any other shift. Jack arrived at the mine, changed into his work clothes, and made his way down into the depths of the earth. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and caverns, and Jack knew every inch of it like the back of his hand. The night shift was always a lonely one. Jack's fellow miners had long since gone home, leaving him alone in the darkness. The only sounds were the steady drip of water and the occasional rumble of a distant explosion as the other ships continued their work. As Jack worked his way deeper into the mine, he began to notice something strange. It started with a feeling of unease, like someone was watching him. Then he heard a faint whispering, just at the edge of his hearing. He stopped and listened, but it was too faint to make out any words. Jack shrugged it off as his imagination, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He worked faster, eager to finish his shift and get out of the mine. But the feeling only grew stronger, and soon he was sure he could hear footsteps behind him. He turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, stretching out before him like an endless void. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, and continued on. But the whispers grew louder, and now he could make out words. They were in a language he didn't understand, a guttural, ancient tongue that sent shivers down his spine. As he worked, he felt something brush against his leg. He looked down, expecting to see a rat or some other small creature, but there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched and followed only grew stronger, until Jack was on the verge of panic. He tried to keep his mind focused on his work, but the whispers and footsteps were impossible to ignore. Finally, he decided he had had enough. He gathered his tools and started back towards the surface. But as he turned a corner, he came face to face with a figure that made his blood run cold. It was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. Its skin was gray and mottled, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. Its limbs were long and twisted, like the branches of a dead tree, and its mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Jack froze, unable to move as the creature advanced on him. He tried to scream, but his throat was tight with fear. The creature let out a low guttural growl and lunged at him. Just as it was about to strike, Jack's training kicked in. He swung his pickaxe with all his might, striking the creature in the chest. It let out a piercing shriek and vanished into thin air. Jack stumbled back, gasping for breath. He knew he had to get out of the mine and fast. He sprinted towards the surface, heart pounding in his chest. When he finally emerged into the fresh air, he collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. He looked around, but there was no sign of the creature. He tried to tell his fellow miners what had happened, but they only laughed and dismissed it as a trick of the mind. From that night on, Jack was a changed man. He could no longer bring himself to work the night shift, and even the thought of going back into the mine sent chills down his spine. He tried to put the incident behind him, but it lingered in the back of his mind like a dark shadow. As the weeks passed, Jack began to notice strange things happening around him. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close without explanation. He would catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of his eye. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his imagination. But the incidents grew more frequent and more intense until he could no longer deny that something was wrong. He turned to his fellow miners for help, but they only shrugged and told him. He was letting his fears get the best of him. He tried to go to the mine authorities, but they too dismissed him as being paranoid. It wasn't until he met an old miner, a man who had retired years ago, that he found someone who believed him. The old man listened to Jack's story, nodding his head sagely. "I've seen it too," he said. "Back in '75. It was a bad year for the mine, and we lost a lot of good men. But it wasn't just accidents and cave-ins. There was something down there with us, something that wasn't human. It took 3 men that year, and no one ever found their bodies." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do I do?" he asked. The old miner thought for a moment. "There's only one thing to do," he said. "You have to go back down there, face your fears, and put an end to it once and for all." Jack knew he was right. He couldn't keep living in fear, and he couldn't let whatever was down there keep tormenting him. He steeled himself and made his way back to the mine. This time he was prepared. He had brought with him a bag of salt, an old superstition that was said to ward off evil spirits. He had also brought a flashlight and a pickaxe, just in case. As he made his way deeper into the mine, the feeling of unease returned. But this time, he was ready for it. He sprinkled salt behind him as he went, creating a protective barrier. The whispers and footsteps grew louder, but Jack didn't falter. He shone his flashlight ahead of him, searching for any sign of the creature. And then he saw it. The same gray, twisted figure he had seen weeks before. It was lurking in the shadows, watching him with glowing red eyes. Jack felt a surge of fear, but he didn't let it paralyze him. He swung his pickaxe with all his might, striking the creature in the chest. It let out a piercing shriek and vanished into thin air. Jack knew he had done it. He had faced his fears and emerged victorious. He made his way back to the surface, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It was 11 p.m., and James had already been working for hours. The office was silent, except for the faint sound of typing and occasional hum of the air conditioning. James worked the night shift, and he was used to the eerie silence that filled the building. He had never felt afraid before, but tonight was different. As James worked on his computer, he heard a strange sound. It was a low growl, but it was unlike anything he had ever heard before. He paused for a moment, hoping it was just his imagination. But then he heard it again, louder this time. He felt his heart start to race and a bead of sweat form on his forehead. James knew he wasn't alone in the building. He decided to investigate, grabbing a flashlight from his desk drawer. James walked down the long, dark hallway toward the source of the sound. His footsteps echoed in the silent office, making him feel even more alone. As he approached the break room, he heard a scratching sound coming from the door. James's heart raced as he slowly pushed the door open with the flashlight. Inside, he saw a mess. Tables and chairs were overturned, and papers littered the floor. But the most terrifying thing was the creature that stood in the corner. It was humanoid in shape, but it was covered in fur and had razor-sharp claws. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and its breath came out in deep growls. James couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature slowly turned its head towards him, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then it lunged at James. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to run. But the creature was too fast, and it caught him by the ankle, sending him crashing to the ground. James felt the creature's hot breath on his neck, and he knew he was going to die. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature suddenly recoiled, letting go of James' ankle. James scrambled to his feet, looking for a way out of the break room. He saw that the window had been shattered, and the creature was no longer in sight. James ran out of the break room, not stopping until he was outside of the building. He took deep breaths, trying to calm down as he looked back at the office. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The next day, James went to work as usual, trying to shake off the events of the previous night. But something was different. He felt like he was being watched, like something was following him. Every time he turned around, he saw nothing, but he could feel a presence. James knew that the creature was still out there somewhere, and he couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Days turned into weeks, and James became increasingly paranoid. He couldn't focus on his work, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He started hearing strange noises at home, and he was convinced that the creature had somehow found him. One night, James was lying in bed, trying to sleep when he heard a scratching sound at his window. His heart raced as he sat up, staring at the glass. But when he looked closer, he saw that it wasn't the creature. It was something worse. A face pressed against the glass, a twisted, grotesque visage that made James's blood run cold. The creature from the office was bad enough, but this was something else entirely. James screamed, but the face just stared back, its eyes filled with malice. Suddenly, the face disappeared, and James was left alone in the dark room. But he knew that it wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and it had found him. The next day, James went to work, determined to confront the creature once and for all. He armed himself with a flashlight and a can of pepper spray and walked down the hallway toward the break room. The office was silent, and James could feel his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the break room, he heard a low growling sound, and he knew that the creature was waiting for him. He pushed open the door, ready to fight, but what he saw was even more horrifying. The creature was standing in the middle of the room, its eyes fixed on something in the corner. James slowly approached, his flashlight illuminating the dark space, and then he saw it. A small, helpless kitten was cowering in a corner, its fur matted and dirty. The creature was growling, but it wasn't attacking. James realized that it wasn't a monster after all. It was just a scared animal protecting the only thing it had left in the world. James slowly lowered his flashlight and looked at the creature. Its eyes met his, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the creature slowly walked towards James, nuzzling its head against his hand. James realized that he had been wrong. The creature wasn't a monster, and it wasn't out to get him. It was just like him, trying to survive in a world that was dark and scary. At that moment, James made a decision. He picked up the kitten and turned to leave the break room. He knew that the creature would follow him, and he knew that he had to do something to help it. Over the next few weeks, James took care of the kitten and the creature, feeding them and giving them a safe place to sleep. He realized that he had found a new purpose in life, and he was grateful for the strange and terrifying events that had led him to this moment. The creature and the kitten became his constant companions, and he knew that he would do anything to protect them. James had faced his fears and come out the other side, stronger and more determined than ever before. And so, as he sat in his office, listening to the faint sound of typing and feeling the warm breath of the creature against his hand, James knew that he had found his place in the world. He had faced his darkest fears and emerged victorious, and he was ready to face whatever the future had in store for him.
I looked around the empty cinema, feeling a shiver run down my spine. It was almost midnight, and I was the only one left in the building. The air was thick with the musty smell of old carpet and stale popcorn, and the silence was deafening. I had been working at the cinema for several months, and I had never been afraid of working the late shift until tonight. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping up on me, but every creak of the old building made me jump. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. As I was completing my final duties, I heard a strange noise coming from one of the screening rooms. It was a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I paused for a moment, trying to rationalize the sound. Maybe it was just the old building settling, or perhaps a stray animal had wandered in. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that it was something else entirely. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knew I had to investigate. As I made my way to the screening room, my footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and my mind started to conjure up all sorts of terrifying scenarios. What if it was a robber, hiding in the cinema until everyone had left? What if it was something even more sinister? As I approached the screening room, the sound grew louder, and I could feel the fear taking hold. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn back and call the police, but my sense of duty won out. I pushed open the door, and what I saw inside left me frozen with fear. As I opened the door, the light flickered and then went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to guide me. The beam of light was feeble and weak, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air in the room was thick and musty, and I could smell the stale scent of popcorn mixed with something more sinister. The darkness and eerie silence made me feel like I was being watched by something, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. That's when I saw the figure standing in the middle of the room. It was a tall, dark figure, and I couldn't make out any features. It seemed like a black void, and the light couldn't penetrate it. The figure seemed to be flickering in and out of existence as if it was made of smoke. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe, as I stared at the figure in the darkness. The room was so dark that it felt like it was swallowing me up, and I could feel my breath catching in my throat. The figure began to move towards me, and I backed away slowly, trying to keep the beam of light on it. As it got closer, I could hear its ragged breathing, and I felt like I was suffocating. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the darkness had consumed me, and I was trapped in a nightmare. As it got closer, I could see that it was wearing a mask, and I could feel its breath on my face. The mask was twisted and grotesque, with jagged teeth and empty eye sockets. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but this was all too real. I screamed, dropping my phone, and ran out of the room as fast as I could. I stumbled down the dark corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, and I could feel a sense of claustrophobia setting in. When I reached the exit, I fumbled with the keys, trying to unlock the door. I could hear footsteps behind me, and I knew that whatever was following me was getting closer. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and burst outside into the cool night air. I looked back, but there was no one there. The cinema was empty and I was alone. Trembling, I called the police and reported what had happened. They searched the cinema, but they found no trace of the intruder. To this day, I still don't know who or what was in that cinema that night, but I know that I will never forget the terror that I felt when I was working alone in the darkness. As the years went by, the memory of the creature faded, but the unease I felt that night never left me. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. One day, a few years after the incident at the mall, I received a call from an old friend who was a paranormal investigator. He told me about a new case he was working on, and he thought I might be interested in helping out. The case involved a series of disappearances in a small town not too far from where I lived. People were going missing, and no one knew why. The police had been called in, but they couldn't find any leads. My friend asked me to come along on the investigation, and I agreed. We packed up our equipment and headed out to the town, ready to uncover the truth. When we arrived, we found a town in fear. The streets were deserted and the houses were boarded up. We talked to a few locals, but they were all tight-lipped, refusing to talk about the disappearances. As we walked through the town, we noticed a strange smell, like something rotten. It reminded me of the smell from the store in the mall, and a chill ran down my spine. We decided to split up and investigate the town separately. My friend took one half and I took the other. As I walked through the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I could feel eyes on me, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. Then, as I turned a corner, I saw it. The creature from the mall was standing at the end of the street, its twisted features illuminated by the moonlight. It was even more horrifying than I remembered, its pale skin stretched taut over its bones. I tried to run, but legs wouldn't respond. The creature began to move towards me, its long fingers reaching out to grab me. I closed my eyes, ready for the worst. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I opened my eyes to see my friend standing behind me, his flashlight illuminating the creature. The creature let out a hiss and disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the stench of decay. We quickly regrouped and compared notes. It turned out that the disappearances in the town had started around the same time that the mall incident had occurred. We began to piece together the clues, and soon we had a theory. The creature was a manifestation of the negative energy that had built up in the mall, feeding on the fear and despair of those who worked and shopped there. The creature had somehow made its way to the town, where it continued to feed on the negative energy, causing the disappearances and spreading fear throughout the community. We knew what we had to do. We had to find a way to banish the creature, to break the cycle of fear and despair. We spent the next few days gathering supplies and preparing for the ritual. It was a risky endeavor, but we knew it was the only way to stop the creature. We gathered in the town square at midnight, surrounded by candles and other ritual items. We began the chant, calling on the ancient gods to banish the creature and cleanse the town of its negative energy. As we chanted, the creature appeared, its twisted features contorted in anger. It lashed out at us, but we stood our ground, continuing the chant. And then, with a final burst of energy, the creature disappeared, its twisted form dissipating into the night. We knew that the ritual had worked. The town was no longer filled with fear and despair. As the ritual ended, a sense of calm washed over the town. The boarded-up homes and shops were slowly reopened, and the streets began to fill with people again. The negative energy that had once been so palpable had been banished. My friend and I were hailed as heroes, and we were invited to stay in the town to celebrate the newfound peace.